Hey everyone, you're listening to Yonder Lies. I'm Hannah Haberman.
And I'm Jesse Bryant.
In the last month, a lot has changed. COVID-19 has permeated the US in profound ways. Social distancing has become the norm for most. Masks and ventilators in overstressed and under-resourced hospitals are all over the headlines. An unprecedented 6.6 million people filed for unemployment earlier this week. And most soberingly, thousands of people are dying. It's a pretty scary time, and unlike anything most of us have lived through before.
And as if that weren't enough, we're seeing mixed messages on different levels from our government, from federal to state to county to town. For better or for worse, parts of the US are cobbling together responses that reflect just how different this country is. And there's been some scary fallout already. Last week, the EPA announced a huge relaxation of environmental rules in response to the pandemic, essentially allowing power plants and factories to determine for themselves if they're able to meet legal requirements on reporting air and water pollution. Basically, it's up to them to self-regulate, which is, in some ways, pretty concerning. For instance, as of this week, in lieu of oversight, the Keystone XL pipeline project, which has been stalled in the courts for years, is being rapidly pushed through.
Yeah, we're navigating totally new terrain. Politically, economically, socially, personally. Every day brings a new soup of emotions. Fear, uncertainty, grief, helplessness, boredom, anxiety, but also compassion, hope, creativity, connection, and bravery. It's a heavy time, and we want to acknowledge the gravity of the current moment. Both Jesse and I have lost jobs in the last couple weeks, which is definitely destabilizing. But the reality is, many people are getting hit a lot harder and don't have the luxury to work at home or have the certainty of a stable home. There's an ongoing crisis as people struggle to pay their bills and meet their rent, especially as certain states, Wyoming included, keep allowing evictions.
Without a doubt, this crisis is both widespread and also illuminates the failures of our society to create stability for the majority of this country. More than half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. The more embodied the work, from people living off of tips in the service industry to people working construction, the more likely the exposure. It's pretty bizarre to compare the headspace I was in when we were making our last episode on wealth and philanthropy to where my head is at now.
Agreed. Originally, we'd planned to release an episode about chronic wasting disease and the elk refuge here in Jackson. And although there are some stark parallels we're looking forward to exploring in our next episode, it just seemed wrong not to address the present moment.
So today, we're going to look briefly at how COVID-19 has impacted Jackson and how those impacts have been shaped by some of the key characteristics of this town. For instance, how is the wealthiest county in the U.S. using its wealth to combat this pandemic? How do Jackson's paradoxical geographic isolation and globalized nature support and compromise mitigation efforts? And how is a town centered around tourism and recreation doing when those ways are being largely put on hold? What is Jackson when Jackson Hole Mountain Resort and Grand Teton National Park are closed?
First, let's talk about wealth here in Teton County and its impact on the COVID response. In our last episode, we interviewed Justin Farrell about his new book, Billionaire Wilderness, which investigates the incredible concentration of wealth in Jackson.
Justin outlined how much of the philanthropy here has been centered on arts and conservation, and how giving to those realms has become the norm, the way to fit in around here and be considered a local. One of the parting questions Justin posed in our last episode was this: how do we move this massive amount of financial capital towards addressing social problems like the housing crisis and homelessness here, toward making sure that the basic needs of a community are being met?
Maybe I'm being a bit optimistic, but it sort of seems like COVID might have been a catalyst for that shift, at least in the short term. As of March 24th, the Community Foundation of Jackson Hole had raised more than $1.4 million for its Community Emergency Response Fund, which will go to help nonprofits providing frontline services. What's really wild here is that one Teton County resident donated $750,000 to this fund.
Oh my God. It's pretty amazing how much money is being funneled back into the community right now. How's that money been distributed so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. $350,000 has gone to support 122's Relief Fund, an organization whose work has centered around helping community members in need of financial or cultural support. As of April 1st, 122 had doled out almost $300,000 to help community members pay urgent personal and household expenses, like rent, medical bills, and health insurance premiums. Those grants helped 306 community members so far, but the organization has received more than 900 applicants for aid, with no sign of those applications slowing or stopping. Although 122 started off with about $500,000 in their relief fund, the hope is that more money will continue to flow to the organization and to people.
Yeah, they're doing such good work, and it's staggering that almost 1,000 applications have already been sent in. There's also been a bunch of local efforts to make masks and informal organizing taking place on Facebook, GroupMe, between friends and coworkers to funnel resources to communities in Jackson and on the Wind River Reservation. Free Wi-Fi has even been set up at the fairgrounds. People are definitely stepping up and at least trying to help.
Okay, so that seems good overall. But what about where Jackson is? Like how it's this tourist town in a pretty big and rural state.
Yeah, there's this sort of funny, paradoxical nature to Jackson that makes this crisis a bit interesting for Teton County. In a geographical sense, Jackson is really, really isolated from the rest of the country and the world. And so in one sense of isolation, Jackson should seem like a pretty ideal place to weather this COVID storm. And yet, like we've talked about in other episodes, Jackson is at the same time also this sort of modern globalist city-state, hugely connected to places like New York and San Francisco, where COVID is rampaging the population.
Right. It seems that some second homeowners have come to the area to wait this out, although the Travel and Tourism Board in Jackson asked those people to go home. But it's hard to say whether or not that happened. And so it's true, yes, that Jackson is currently way more isolated from COVID than, say, Brooklyn, at least for now. But this connectedness means that Jackson will probably see cases rise differently than more truly rural places. But what is ultimately similar between more rural spaces in Jackson is also the enemy of any powerful virus: a lot of open space.
Yeah, and then there's also the fact that despite an enormous amount of resources, Jackson doesn't seem to be any better situated to deal with the actual health crisis than anywhere else. Medical facilities throughout the country are already overburdened by COVID in their local communities, and in a place like Jackson, if tourism were to continue, this margin of inadequacy would only grow larger.
So, how is Wyoming stacking up in comparison to other states in terms of effectiveness of response? A social distancing scoreboard created by New York location data and analytics company Unicast hasn't been shy in its assessment. Wyoming has received an F and is, at the time we're making this podcast, the lowest state on the scoreboard. Basically, the website uses smartphone data to compare how much people are moving now to how much people were moving pre-COVID, then assigns them a letter grade based on that change. It monitors changes in average mobility and has also recently started differentiating data to reflect changes in essential travel, like going to the grocery store or the pharmacy, and non-essential travel, like going to restaurants and stores not really related to food and health. Frankly, Wyoming's data isn't looking too good. Changes in average mobility is less than 25%, and changes in essential travel is less than 55%, which the website has decided, using public health recommendations as a metric, gets a big ol' F. I think the data should be taken with a little grain of salt, as the reality of living in a really large and really spread out rural state is that people do drive a lot, for work, to get groceries. But regardless, Wyoming can and should be doing more. But once I started looking at the county-by-county breakdown, the picture got a little more complex. Teton County actually has a B, the highest of all counties in Wyoming, with the change in average mobility almost 70% as of April 1st. And this reflects a broader reality. Teton County has been taking much more aggressive measures than the rest of Wyoming. Although he's encouraged people to stay at home, Governor Mark Gordon of Wyoming has yet to issue a statewide stay-at-home mandate, deviating from neighboring states like Idaho and Montana. The main distinction here is that of an order, or a mandate, and that of a recommendation. One is technically enforceable, the other isn't, and unfortunately, recommendations seem to fit a little bit more into that Wild West individualistic mindset than mandates do. To be fair, the governor did extend closures of schools and businesses until the end of April earlier this week, and asked anyone coming to Wyoming from another state or country for non-work purposes to immediately self-quarantine for 14 days. But still, is it too little and too late? Local officials in Teton County seem to have anticipated this slow response from state officials and have tried to take more drastic steps. After an extended debate, the county adopted a county-wide stay-at-home order on April 1st, and was also ahead of the state in requiring restaurants and non-essential businesses to shutter. Mayor Pete Muldoon, along with mayors Invictor and Driggs, have asked visitors to stay away for the spring. And in the next couple weeks, we're going to see how these decision-making choices play out and evolve.
Yeah, I think something that is really worrying me about this pandemic so far is that it is still largely an urban phenomenon. And I'm still spooked by what's going to happen when this hits rural America. And I suspect that it might hit harder than people are expecting, and potentially even harder than it hit urban America.
Tell me more.
The first thing is just susceptibility to COVID. Rural America is older and largely more health compromised on a whole than urban America. For instance, diabetes, a disease that is linked to much higher mortality rates if COVID is contracted, is significantly more prevalent in rural America than in urban. And it's not just diabetes. There are sort of health complications like obesity that are significantly higher in rural America right now in 2020 than they are in urban America. So there's sort of this susceptibility part of this. The second thing is there's a political divide happening right now. Rural America is significantly more skeptical of this virus than is urban America. Potentially that's because it hasn't hit yet. But the other thing is that rural America is more tuned into media outlets like Fox News, who have been continuously regurgitating these sort of skeptical narratives about the virus and supporting these sort of misinformation problems coming from the White House. More rural states have significantly lower ratings from the agencies in taking social distancing seriously. And whether that's a function of it not being there yet or this sort of skepticism is hard to say. But either way, it's a little disturbing. And then the last thing is that the medical infrastructure in rural America has been disappearing for over a decade. Rural hospitals have been closing, and places like New York City, despite having huge populations, also have enormous medical infrastructures. And I sort of worry what's going to happen in places like Wyoming, where sometimes you have one hospital for a geographic area the size of the state of, I don't know, Virginia. And when this hits, it's not clear what exactly is going to happen.
Totally. It's definitely a bit of a spooky situation to imagine. And like we've said, we're just going to have to see what happens.
Yep. Okay, but getting back to Jackson, the ways in which tourism drives so much of the economy and life here is also affecting the way in which the community is and will be affected by COVID. Within this fact, there are two obvious effects: the economy and transmission. This might be sort of obvious, but most communities in our globalized capitalist system are structured in a way where most of the economic activity is focused on either maintaining the community itself, so like hospitals, grocery stores, schools, or on creating products, whatever they are, water bottles, tires, oil, to be sold into the regional or global economy. This isn't really true in Teton County, Wyoming. Rather than depending on a market to sell physical products into, Teton County is hugely dependent on people physically traveling to the area and spending money. And this has basically been put on pause. right? You can't sell a hike in the Tetons on Amazon. And as we mentioned above, the Jackson Hole Travel and Tourism Board recently asked travelers to cancel spring plans, and the three central drivers of tourism, Jackson Hole Mountain Resort, Grand Targhee, and Grand Teton National Park, have all closed. This obviously affects business owners in a very direct way, but it also affects the town and county government. Since taxes are enormously low here in Teton County, one of the only ways the government can raise money to fund things like road repair, wildlife overpasses, and public transportation is through a sales tax. And if tourists can't come to Jackson and buy things, the government will have their main source of income slashed, and many of the public amenities that make this such a great community to live in will potentially disappear. And then there's the sort of public health dimension of a tourist economy. For a while, tourism continued here even as COVID was becoming more mainstream in the US, which means that for almost a month, people from all over the world were still coming to Teton County, Wyoming, and bringing with them whatever microbial life they did. How this affects the way the virus moves through the community will be pretty interesting to see, and my guess is it will be pretty devastating. For instance, a very similar community in Idaho, Blaine County, home to Sun Valley Ski Resort, has the highest rate of infection of anywhere in the US by some measures. And similarly, high rates are now being seen in Summit County, Colorado, and in Aspen. These rates in tourist towns, paired with the obvious lack of medical infrastructure compared to the urban centers like New York or LA, casts an uncertain shadow over these sorts of towns, including Jackson, in the weeks to come.
There's one last thing we'd like to touch on, which is almost impossible to detangle from tourism. What's happened to recreation and the recreation economy here? Like we said, JHMR and Grand Targhee closed in the middle of March, leaving hundreds jobless, both directly and indirectly, from restaurants and hotels and all the businesses that cater to the ski industry. Grand Teton National Park closed about 2 weeks ago in an attempt to minimize tourist traffic to the area.
As a result, there's been a significant influx of people flocking into the backcountry to ski, snowboard, and snowmobile. The local hill, Snow King, is still open for uphill travel, and trails around town are still open and accessible. As more places to recreate close, places that are still accessible are becoming oversaturated and strained.
Over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of dialogue about what it means to recreate responsibly, as recreating while staying 6 feet away from others is allowed in the current Jackson stay-at-home order. Can we maintain appropriate social distancing standards in the backcountry or on local trails? People are asking, what are potential repercussions as more inexperienced users move into the backcountry because they can't ski at the resort? Is it responsible to potentially put oneself at risk in the context of an already stressed healthcare system?
In many places over the past couple weeks, trailheads and public lands have been closed, and although that is somewhat true here, access to awesome recreation opportunities does still exist. While many people in Seattle have seen a lot of public lands access closed, people in Jackson are still skiing every day. And because access has remained in Jackson, that poses this sort of moral gray area, like of whether to be in solidarity with the people throughout the country who can no longer recreate in the ways that keep them healthy, or do you just keep skiing? Because here in Jackson, we can do that.
Right. The embodied experience of staying home in Jackson is fundamentally different than staying home in New York City or Seattle, which means people are asking themselves, and those around them, different moral and ethical questions. We're all trying to figure out how to both participate in this broader, globalized moment and participate responsibly to keep ourselves and others healthy, and we're trying to figure out what that means in our own contexts. It's confusing, and like you said, in many ways, it's a gray area. I guess what I'm trying to say is this. Everyone is trying to understand how the virus fits into our lives as a human collective and in the context of where we live, our day-to-day patterns and choices and community norms. We're trying to balance the global and the local, the personal and the political, the present and the future. I guess that's part of the task of living in this time, figuring out how to create our own new normal and reconciling with the fact that that normal looks different for different people.
That's pretty poetic, because that's the task of living basically at any time, on any day. How do we as individuals adapt our relationship to society over time? And how does society then adapt to these new contexts?
As we're all in the process of making meaning from this moment, my hope is that people calibrate their decision-making to support the health and well-being of our community, of those who are our most vulnerable. It's time to have hard conversations, to hold each other accountable, to ask ourselves, where are we situated, and what can we make of our context? How can we look after each other and keep adapting?
We definitely don't have all the answers, and we'd love to hear from you as well. How does Jackson fit into this bigger pandemic picture? How does the Capitol in Jackson continue to support this community? And what holes does that Capitol still need to address? In what ways is Jackson rural? And in what ways is it plugged into a broader capitalistic global process?
Wherever you are, and whatever this moment means to you, feels like to you, however your life is being impacted, take care and take care of those around you. Thanks for listening.